Titled Acting When Others Can't, Middle Power Diplomacy in Challenging Times. And of course, our first reaction is, when didn't we live in challenging times? We're going to focus on the role of middle powers in global diplomacy at a time of, let's face it, increasing tensions and polarization among the major powers. There's no doubt we are facing changing alliances globally. We're still recovering from a global pandemic. There are loud calls for UN reform, a full-blown war on Europe's doorstep, and another perhaps confrontation brewing in the Pacific. So there couldn't be a better time to talk diplomacy and ask, do middle powers have greater flexibility and adaptability in responding to always changing circumstances? And because of where we are, we have a special focus, I think, on Central Asia and Kazakhstan's role as a potential influential middle power mediator. Now, they say half the art of diplomacy is saying nothing, but I hope that won't happen today. So I'm going to introduce the panel first. Ambassador Thomas Greminger is the director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy since May 2021. He served as Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation for Europe from July 2017 until July 2020. These are very high-level panelists. They're worth listening to. I'm only giving a very brief example, a taster of all their qualifications and CV. Danny Quah, National University of Singapore. Danny is Lau Ka-shing Professor in Economics and the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He researches and analyzes the economic performances of alternative international systems and the impact on social cohesion. David Apsuri, General Director of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in Georgia. David is an ambassador of Georgia, working as acting and deputy foreign minister, ambassador to Georgia to Baltic countries, China, Mongolia, and Vietnam, with a special interest in China. I think that's fair to say. And Joshua Lincoln, Tufts University, has 25 years of international senior level experience across 4 continents, Africa, Europe, Asia, North America, in leadership and management roles in external affairs, governance, peace and conflict, diplomacy, multilateral, strategic communications, and government relations. Very, very highly qualified. Mr. Maulen Ashimbayev, Chairman of the Senate of the Kazakhstan Parliament. He has vast experience as a lawmaker in both chambers of parliament. Prior to his appointment, he'd served in Kazakhstan President's office. He also has extensive background in analytics. For many years, he headed Kazakhstan Institute for Strategic Studies and the Analytical Center of Security Council of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Now, I will be starting the conversation in a moment, but first, I would like to call on Mr. Ambassador David Apsuri to come to the podium and deliver a brief presentation. Maulen. This would be Maulen, I think. Yeah, no.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, I would like to welcome all our guests and partners. We appreciate your participation in the Astana International Forum. I wish you productive work and pleasant stay in Kazakhstan. At present session, we are expected to deliver our thoughts and ideas on the role of middle powers in the international relations. It is obvious that the development of the world is getting more uncertain and alarming because of a number of factors, including growing contradictions and tensions between major powers. Given these realities, the role of middle powers is increasing. Their positions and activities are becoming crucial for developing international cooperation in many areas, as well as tackling challenges and threats in the modern world. In the past decades, we have seen a growing inefficiency of key global institutions, which were initially designed to ensure security and prevent wars and conflicts. It is also clear that the UN Security Council needs reforms and transformations. The effectiveness of this key institution, speaking diplomatically, raises doubts. The OSCE also needs new approaches. As noted recently by President Tokayev, over the past 13 years, the OSCE has not adopted a single decision, either at ministerial or other formats. As a result of the ongoing war of sanctions, as well as economic nationalism across the world, the WTO mechanisms have faded into backgrounds. Global treaties that ensured strategic nuclear security and arms reduction for recent decades are in jeopardy now. All these tendencies are taking place at times when the world faces serious challenges and threats, including conflicts, pandemics, growing inequality, environmental issues, and extremism. Today, relations between major powers are at their worst point since the end of the Cold War. This applies both to the relations between Russia and the West, as well as between China and the United States. I will not discuss in detail the causes of this process. Instead, let me focus on the role of middle powers in the current situation. At times of ongoing clinch between great countries, middle powers can play an important role in promoting a constructive agenda at the international level. In fact, this process is already underway. First, middle powers have been promoting peace initiatives and providing humanitarian assistance to countries in need or certain social groups. Many European countries can be considered as a good case in this context. Second, middle powers are strengthening cooperation and interaction outside the framework of global international institutions. Third, they also demonstrate eagerness to discuss urgent environmental, social, humanitarian, and other problems affecting millions of people across the globe. In fact, our Astana International Forum could be considered as a good example illustrating that tendency. And finally, middle powers are now more active in allocating resources for scientific researches in critical areas for mankind, in particular in the fields of medicine, biochemistry, green technologies, etc. Thus, middle powers can play, and they do play, a positive role in the international affairs, promoting the culture of dialogue and inclusive development. Moreover, in my opinion, in the medium term, international institutions and mechanisms ensuring security and interaction must be transformed and reformed in order to increase their efficiency. I believe it is time to start moving towards a new paradigm of the international relations based on the principles of equality, dialogue, inclusion, and respect for the territorial integrity of all states. In this new paradigm, middle powers ought to play a key role. It is crucial to move away from the international system developed around the interests of the great powers. That system could be considered as a remnant of World War II as well as the Cold War. Today, institutions that operate as networks are more effective. It can be applied to international institutions as well. In order to demonstrate the opportunities of middle countries, I give you two examples related to Kazakhstan's policy. The first case is the Astana process on Syria. This negotiating mechanism was initiated in 1917 by Kazakhstan's government. Since then, it has become an important international platform aimed at resolving the Syrian conflict. Astana hosted 17 international meetings, which led to the sharp reduction of hostilities and helped decrease violence and civilian casualties. For the first time, the government and the armed opposition of Syria were brought to direct negotiations. It is worth noting that the Astana process boosted the Geneva process on Syria. The second case is related to the Congress of the Leaders of World and Traditional Religions, which has been regularly held in Kazakhstan since 2003. Today, our country is being perceived as one of the international centers for interfaith dialogue and spiritual diplomacy. The 7th Congress, held in September last year, was very meaningful and successful. More than 100 delegations from 51 countries participated in the Congress. Outstanding religious leaders, Pope Francis, Supreme Imam of Al-Azhar Ahmed al-Taib, Chief Rabbis of Israel, Yitzhak Yosef and David Lau addressed believers and the international community from Astana. Spiritual leaders productively discussed the issues of interreligious dialogue and the role of religious leaders in overcoming the challenges and threats of the modern world. Now, in accordance with the initiative of President Tokayev, we started to hold a number of roundtables in the spiritual centers of the world in order to discuss and promote the results and decisions of the religious summit. These two cases show the capacity of middle countries to address the important problems of the international agenda. They show how countries like Kazakhstan can play a bigger role in mitigating urgent as well as strategic problems of the modern world. In short, there are many opportunities in the international relations related to the middle powers. I am sure our session will help better understand those opportunities and outline specific mechanisms to unveil middle powers' constructive potential in years to come. I wish you all fruitful and productive discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. That was excellent, and obviously describing Kazakhstan there as a middle power. Can I just ask you one question? I know you sit down and relax now, but before you do, you know Rudyard Kipling and his description of this area as where the great game was played. And it's been a theatre for great competition, power competition, rather than geopolitical players, I think. Today, though, I see the emphasis, and following on from the President's remarks yesterday, on the region resolving differences and enhancing cooperation. Is that how you see Kazakh's role?
Sure. Kazakhstan is doing a lot in order to increase cooperation between Central Asian countries, and at the same time we are trying to keep balance in relations with major powers. It's very important for Kazakhstan to keep good relations with Russia, and because you know we have 7,000 common border with Russia. Russia is one of the biggest trade partners of Kazakhstan. We have close historical ties. And at the same time, we need to keep good relations with China, which is one of the biggest investors in Kazakhstan. At the same time, we are interested in developing different projects with China, in particular the Middle Corridor, which our president mentioned yesterday. And of course, the European Union is one of the important partners of Kazakhstan. We enjoy good cooperation with the European Union. We attracted billions of dollars investment from European countries, and therefore we are interested in developing close relations with our European countries. At the same time, of course, Central Asia is our priority. We pay great attention to develop relations with our neighbors because, first of all, historical reasons, we have very close ties, we have the same roots, and our languages are almost the same. Therefore, we need to keep very close, very friendly, and strategic relations with our Central Asian neighbors. Besides, there are some problems in our region which could be addressed and resolved only by our joint efforts. For example, water issues. You know that water is a big problem in Central Asia, and we are experiencing water shortage in some areas, in some regions of Central Asia. Therefore, we need to address these issues together, and we have some plans, and I hope we will succeed in implementing those plans. Therefore, yes, Kazakhstan pays great attention to developing relations with Central Asian countries, with major powers, and it's very important for us to keep balance between influence of great powers. Therefore, it's our policy which we have been conducting for 13 years, and more than 30 years, and we can see that this policy is rather successful. Thank you.
Thank you. And you've just answered my next question, which was how difficult a balancing act is it between China and Russia for Kazakhstan? So that's fine. Let's go to Switzerland. Let's go to Ambassador Thomas Greminger, Swiss diplomat and former Secretary General of the OSCE. Thomas, can countries still be in the middle of such a polarized world, or do they have to take sides?
Well, I would say the short answer is we do indeed live in an extremely polarized world, and the pressure to take sides is increasing rapidly on all of us. You have a number of deepening dividing lines. There is the dividing line between democracies and autocracies. There is this trend towards the bifurcation of the global economy into a Western sphere led by the US and a sphere led by China, each with junior partners. And then, of course, there is the argument, while Russia's war against Ukraine is still hot, we are quickly, decisively moving into a new Cold War, in a Cold War 2.0, with, of course, a different confrontation than in the Cold War 1.0, but with very similar familiar and scary repercussions. We see emerging ideologies, we see a total breakdown of dialogue and cooperation, in particular in the security field. So these dividing lines, they put many states under a huge pressure to take sides. Now, you would think that for some countries, this is a relatively easy choice. North America, Western Europe, well, it's clear they would take the Western camp. At first sight, it seems to be an easy choice. Already, if you dig a bit deeper, you realize it's not so obvious. Yes, Europe is definitely united when it comes to protecting territorial integrity, containing military aggression. But already when you think about the future of a European security order, it becomes more complicated. Not everybody, would like to be in a confrontational security architecture for decades to come. Many would wish some cooperative security elements to come back. then there is the question, how autonomous Europe should be in its security posture in the future. And obviously, if you think about the economic sphere, there is even less appetite for most Europeans to have to join one of the blocs. Now, for many other countries, even within the OECD area, the situation is even more complicated. Partly because of their geography. They just happen to be in the middle, either between Russia and the West, between Russia and China, or between the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian regions. Turkey, Serbia, Mongolia, I think Kazakhstan is an excellent example as well. And hence, these countries are tempted, are pursuing multi-vector foreign policies. And then you have those that are in the middle by choice, simply to hedge their best bets to see what happens in terms of great power competition. And I think this is an attitude that you particularly see in the global south, Asia, Africa. And let me conclude on that. And I think what you see is that at the end there is relatively little sense of cohesion among these middle powers, beyond quite some political symbolism. The result of their action often do look similar, but as I have mentioned, their motivations are different. And this is probably also why, and slightly unlike in the past, there is relatively little cooperation among the non-aligned, the neutral, however you want to call them, or the middle powers. Little cooperation that really goes, beyond political symbolism. I'll stop here.
All right, thank you, Ambassador. Let's go to Georgia. David Atsuri. You worked as acting and deputy foreign minister of Georgia. Can the middle power diplomacy increase the importance of the so-called East-West bridge, do you think? Countries in a new global economic agenda. We mentioned there, Thomas Greminger mentioned Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Turkey.
Thank you, Stephen. First, I really very much honored and pleased to welcome the Mr. Chairman of the Parliament and distinguished guests he presented, as well as audience and all interested parties. Thank you for this question. Yeah. Definitely, in this turbulent environment, I think it's paramount to preserve a certain balance. I'm not confident in that sense. So I wish to all of you to be in the middle, in the mostly positive way, in the middle, starting from the family basis and ending by global problems, to keep balance, to keep harmony, first of all, with yourself. So that is, I think, crucial today. As to a group of countries of the region that trying to set up a new model of partnership, I have to mention a number of trends regarding the middle power diplomacy and regarding this group of countries that I think ought to be taken into consideration. First, in the fragmented, polarized world, no doubt there is a set of arguments in favor of increased role of middle power countries. They're changing alongside with the changing world. One of the changes, one of the trends is a drive to regional cooperation. We witnessed that quite evidently, and not on the regional level, but sub-regional level. And if we consider the classical scheme of middle power countries or criteria as established and emerging as constitutive and behavioral, as conservative and liberal, and some other, we would say, factors, we have to say that evidently we witness the promotion and nurturing of a mixed or hybrid middle power countries that assume the economic motivation of partnership and also quite intensify international cooperation. So within this group of middle power countries, also we witness the advance of the so-called bridge countries, the countries that are located at the crossroads of distant marketplaces, starting from China, ending by Europe. And among them are such countries as Kazakhstan, as Georgia, as Azerbaijan and Turkey. So we have to say that we just now have a chance to observe new trends in this regard based on new approach and new motivation of promotion of commercial interest alongside with, I mentioned, increase of international activity. Okay. Kazakhstan is the best example in this respect, and we've just picked up some news from Mr. Chairman. What stands behind that, in my view? First of all, we have to admit that this is not a story of regional partnership of these and other countries in the region. If we go back to the 90s, if we just refresh the pipeline diplomacy, the construction of oil and gas pipelines from Azerbaijan to Turkey through Georgia, if we refresh the shipment of the goods, transportation of the oil from Kazakhstan by rail also to European marketplaces. So there's a unique experience obtained from that, from those years here. So that's why not to repeat that today?
I understand. That's a very good point. Let's go to Joshua, because I'm wondering whether the increase in influence by the middle powers is perhaps a sign that US rallying and power and leadership is not sufficient anymore. What are your thoughts on middle power diplomacy?
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who's come to have this conversation today. I want to suggest to you that what we're seeing is the rise of what I'm thinking of as bicycle diplomacy. And I'll give an example, which is when there's congestion, when the road is stuck, when cars, trucks, buses, large vehicles cannot get through, when there's tension, when there's fragmentation, who manages to move forward? I ask you in the traffic here in Astana. I was in Paris last week. It took me 90 minutes to go 3 kilometers in a taxi. Bicycles. Kazakhstan is an example of bicycle diplomacy. Switzerland is another example. There are very small states that are acting as middle powers. I will give you 3 very brief examples. Liechtenstein had something called the Security Council Veto Initiative a year ago that was adopted by the General Assembly as the most interesting way to curb the power of the veto. Prime Minister Motley of Barbados has initiated the single most significant reform proposal for the IMF that we have seen in about 75 years, Barbados. And the third that I would mention is Vanuatu. Vanuatu has brought the most significant legal action asking for an advisory opinion before the International Court of Justice on climate change. In all 3 cases, these are very small states who are acting as middle powers. They're finding a way forward through the congestion, through the difficulties. I think this is bringing out a requirement for a new set of sort of capacities for success. The ability to find the right fora, the ability to make partnerships quickly, the ability to emphasize your interests rather than your ideology. And I think the last one is to develop a measure of agility inside yourself and outside in your relations. Inside is usually the most challenging for governments. Governments are comfortable with a siloed system of ministries and with a set of fora that are very predictable. The new world, the difficult world, you have to work harder, like on a bicycle. You have to make effort, you have to take risks, and you have to be ready to work in a much more lateral and engaged fashion. And this is a challenge for many of us. Anyway, that would be my short answer.
Bicycle diplomacy. This is a new one. Let's take that forward, shall we? Danny, let's go to you. Why do you think middle powers might actually be able, through diplomacy or otherwise, help the world move to a place where the great powers themselves don't want to go? Is there evidence as well of sort of historical examples of middle powers successfully achieving their ends, getting their way against the preference of great powers?
Thank you, Mr. Cole, and thank you for having me here to the wonderful audience. I wanted to follow up to address your question by trying to be very clear on what the goals we should have in mind when middle powers or even smaller states seek to move ahead. Because if we're going to discuss what we can do, we should also be clear why we want to do the things that we can do. What are we trying to achieve? In Joshua's wonderful imagery of bicycle diplomacy, you know, I'm from Singapore, and Singapore is far smaller than practically every other state in the world. So we're not even bicycles, we're roller skates. But we have an agility that I hope is helpful in this thinking. Now, Mr. Cole, these two parts of my answer, which is why we want to do the things that we do and how we achieve it, what examples we have. You know, you set the stage really well when you introduced all of us, because you said there's a view that says middle powers are needing to adapt and respond, where we are passive. We are, in a sense, bystanders, seeing the great powers at play.
Non-threatening.
Non-threatening. And then, when you and Mr. Chairman followed up by saying, well, Kazakhstan's actually doing more than being just a bystander. It's actually exercising agency on a lot of wonderful fronts. So to put what you and Mr. Chairman have said in context, I think we need to be very, very clear about what, as middle powers, we are trying to achieve. The first thing we want to achieve is we need to shake off the shackles of realism. Someone mentioned realism yesterday, and realism comes with the idea that the great powers do what they will, the rest of us suffer what we must. And what we're here trying to do is to go beyond that, trying to show what we want to achieve. So let me say what the things we, as a group, middle powers and even roller skating countries, third nations, might want to achieve. We want a world that is peaceful and prosperous. We do not want a world where trade opportunities are removed from us, where sanctions cobble our economic prosperity, where trade conflicts and techno-nationalism, as the IMF managing director suggested, could result in a 7% reduction of the size of the global economy. For many of us, middle powers and smaller states, far higher. We want national sovereignty and territorial integrity. We don't want to be dragged into other people's conflicts. Even if we're part of a collective defense agreement, we should not be made to take actions that advance the interests of this great power or that great power. Those are the things that we want. Here's how we've tried to achieve them in the past. We've exercised our credibility, standing outside the great power spheres of influence. Second, we come across as an honest broker. Third, there's strength in numbers. And all three of these have shown up in the two examples that I'm going to end my intervention with. First, the Ottawa Arms Treaty of the 1990s going into the 2000s. This was a collection of third nations, small powers, who wanted to rid the world of landmines. The great powers disagreed. But after 15 years, bringing on board hundreds of countries, eventually Joe Biden also agreed that they would work towards removing their deployment of landmines in territories around the world. Second, the Vienna Declaration of Human Rights from 1993 was a movement by middle powers and small nations to get the great powers to recognize and behave in a way that acknowledge human rights around the world, properly interpreted. I think there are many other examples. Bandung Principles are another, and many other arrangements that I hope my panelists will also be able to think about. But I leave you with that. We need to be extra clear about what we're trying to achieve, and I've said what I think we should be trying to achieve. And I've told you the three superpowers that we have: credibility, honest broker, strength in numbers. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Yeah, that was very just one brief follow-up, Danny. Should middle powers choose a side? Is that the sensible, realistic thing for them to do, rather than try and act perhaps in a way that may lead to overreaching?
I think we should, let me quickly off the cuff say we should definitely not choose a side. By choosing a side, middle powers, smaller nations, third nations end up subverting their very legitimate aspirations towards the zero-sum goals of great power competition. This is not something we should be getting into. We should be looking to advance our own interests based on principles. The principles that I've described, principles that we need to continue to carry forwards. Principles expressed in the United Nations, the Bandung Principles, and a range of such agreements. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Danny. If anybody wants to come in on those remarks, and Mr. Chairman, please, feel free.
My colleagues raised important issues related to choosing sides and in this situation and siding with major powers and so on. I should say, I want to say two things. Firstly, every country, every middle power must realize policy based on its national interests. In Kazakhstan, it is the case. We are conducting policy which is based on our national interests. Our national interests include our territorial integrity, our independence, security for our people, stability of our country, of state institutions. Therefore, I think it is not so correct to ask which side we should choose. It's better to ask what is your national interest? What is your national interest now, in future, in years to come? In our case, in Kazakhstan case, I cannot say about other countries, but in Kazakhstan's case, the most important goal for us to keep and strengthen our independence and economic development, as well as economic development of Kazakhstan. And in order to achieve those goals, we will cooperate with major powers. We will cooperate with the United States. It's one of the biggest investors of Kazakhstan's economy. In particular, American companies invested a lot in Kazakhstan's energy sector, and therefore we appreciate the investments, and therefore we want to work with them and to develop new projects. At the same time, we're interested in working with Chinese companies as well as European companies, and of course Russia is, as I mentioned, is one of our main partners. Therefore, in order to achieve our goals, our independence, our territorial integrity, and our economic development, we need to keep good relations with all major powers. Second point, I think my colleagues also raised this issue, that it is necessary to move towards a new paradigm of international relations. We need to leave stereotypes and approaches of the Cold War. Yeah. Today, our international system is developing around interests of great countries, great powers. I don't think it's right approach in the 21st century. We need new paradigm, new approach. In that new paradigm, balance interests of all countries should be balanced, and we need to respect the interests of all countries, treat them equally. That's the priority. That's the main point of new paradigm. Therefore, I think we need work towards establishing this new paradigm, this new system, and it's also it is also on Kazakhstan's international agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go to Thomas Greminger next, and then Joshua wants to come in on this, and I'm sure David will as well. But Thomas first. The main aim, I would say, of middle power diplomacy is security and cooperation and self-interest, guarding self-interest. How can middle powers help promote security and cooperation in the current political climate or environment?
Well, let me perhaps at the outset underline the need for these bridge-building countries in a polarized world. I think we do need, countries that have good relations with stakeholders on both sides of the divide, countries that want to de-escalate tensions, provide frameworks for dialogue, countries that try to seek common ground to manage relations constructively. So I think we need these bridge builders. Second, I think bridge building, trying to occupy the middle ground does not mean to be indifferent to what is happening. It does not mean to be neutral in terms of values. When it comes to the violation of international law, international standards and principles, I think these countries can be very firm, very clear. This doesn't undermine the role of being a bridge builder. And I think, here I come to the point that the chairman just made. I think these bridge-building countries do bridge building because of their values, but also because of their national interests. These countries, in particular middle powers, have an interest in a predictable, in a fair international system that is based on the rule of law. And the alternative would be anarchy. The alternative would be might equals right. And I think that's not in our interest. And we have these interests to create opportunities for trade and for enabling working together, also to deal with common threats and challenges. Now, I think you asked me how can middle powers go about that. I think one obvious way is standing up for effective multilateral institutions. Insist on implementing existing commitments, principles, calling out for double standards, and, well, highlight the benefit of cooperation, in particular when it comes to these transnational threats and challenges. Middle powers, are best placed to try to identify middle ground, areas where interests would converge, where we can provide constructive answers in a complex and interdependent world. And of course, middle bridge builders often have a convening power that they can exploit, and I think Kazakhstan is an excellent example for doing that. And our very presence here, I think, is an illustration of this. The same goes for the country I come from. I think there is, again, coming back to this polarized world, there is a need more for safe, protected spaces, for inclusive dialogue, and that's what we can provide.
Thank you, Thomas. Let's go to Joshua. Your thoughts. Who's pedaling fastest on this one, Joshua?
I'll pick up where Thomas left off. I think I said earlier there are no small powers. There are maybe small states. All small states have the ability to act as middle powers. But I believe strong institutions are critical to middle states. This is part of the way you avoid taking sides, is the strength of international multilateral institutions, which is the point that was just made. Interestingly, there are two cases before the International Court of Justice that relate to Russia and Ukraine. And part of the frustration that everyone has is that the institution, the Security Council, that should be able to give clear answers on this issue, is not able to. So you see the parallel or the relationship between the strength and the health of multilateral institutions and the ability of actors other than great powers to maneuver that system. My second point is we haven't really made mention of it yet, but non-state actors become critically important partners to middle powers. There is perhaps it is a synergy of size, but the ability to work with business, the ability to work with civil society, the ability to work with indigenous groups, broadly speaking, and I would include here the issue of gender. This panel, notwithstanding, the ability to bring more women into leadership, into conversation, into these multilateral processes across the board becomes, I think, an inherent objective of middle power diplomacy. Last week, I will give an illustration. As I said, I was in Paris. I was there for the second round of the intergovernmental negotiations on the Plastics Treaty. And it was very interesting to see one set of states, let's call them great power states, who are actually all in agreement about the kind of treaty they wanted, and then another group of states led by the likes of Peru, Ecuador, Senegal, Switzerland, and a few others, who very gently but quite firmly took control of the agenda, using their numbers, using coalitions, a number of them led by women representatives, and moved the status quo back towards the middle of the discussion. You don't achieve quick results with this. You achieve slow results. And you have to work, what you see is these states working in partnerships and in coalitions that are creative. They are constantly looking for new and interesting ways to achieve their objectives. Thank you.
Joshua. David, do you want to come in on this?
I would like to continue would say one remark. Joshua, that is linked with the size of the country. Definitely, I think that's correct, that not the size is important. I think its influence is important, and many other factors in the whole system of international cooperation. And definitely, when I mentioned that the regionalism is on the rise today in terms of involvement of mid-power countries, I can give the other example, the non-alignment movement that was popular in 60s, 70s, and 80s, but motivated mostly by individual agenda of the countries, by individual, I would say, interaction. What we're witnessing today, we're witnessing that non-alignment movement now probably, at least it is a high degree of probability that might be some of group of countries consolidated at regional and sub-regional basis, and they will be working together, cooperating under the umbrella of non-alignment movement. So there are drastic changes ahead, and one of the major issues is how to combine, I think you agree with me, economic motivation with the security risks today. Since I mentioned that some new models of cooperation, as the model of bridge countries here, I mentioned a number of countries of South Caucasus and Central Asia that are cementing new models. The thing is that what might be ratio in future in terms of economic motivation on some security risks. So that's why I think it is extremely important to develop the regional projects that might be, they are cementing, I think, minimizing the security also risks. As, by the way, I can give you one example that is newly proposed, the Black Sea submarine electric cable that is going from Azerbaijan through Georgia, Sibet submarine to Europe. So that might be one of the examples of that. And there are a number of extra examples to prove that fact.
All right, thank you, David. Joshua mentioned groups, blocks, and several of you have mentioned, and I wonder whether middle powers, if they're going to be truly effective, should work in blocks or should they work on their own. Joshua, the United States may no longer be a unipower, but could it be the essential power? I know you don't speak for the US, but I'm landing you with this because I think you're American. Could the US be an essential power in a group of like-minded network partners?
Thank you for the qualification. Just to confirm, I do not speak for the United States government. They would not wish me to speak that way. I would not wish to speak that way. I think the United States varies in its behavior between the behavior of a great power and the behavior of a power that understands the power of coalitions and of joining partnerships and groups. And actually, this is the interesting tension. At times, it pursues national interest in concert with others, and at other times, it decides that its national interest goes in separate ways. I suppose it's not very different from any other country in that respect. It's just a very big country, and therefore, every time it changes direction, everybody notices. I think this essential point about the pursuit of national interests, but I think we have to, in a way, evolve national interests to make it a little bit less nationalistic and a little bit more, let's put greater emphasis on the word interest than on the word national, because so often interests these days are shared. Again, I would take you back to the Conference on Biodiversity, for example. The High Ambition Coalition was Costa Rica, began the High Ambition Coalition and brought in France. Together, they built up a coalition of about 90 plus countries. They eventually got to a convention that served everybody. In the Plastics Treaty I was making reference, the High Ambition Coalition is led by Rwanda and Norway. Again, Rwanda and Norway. But they've started the coalition. The United States is officially part of the coalition. That doesn't stop the United States from having its own perspectives, but it begins to create the kind of groups and dynamics that allows for movement forward. So I think there's a tension. I don't think we get away from it. I don't think there's an easy solution, but the malleability of coalitions and of groups forming and unforming around particular issues, I think is a new reality.
Yeah, a new paradigm.
A new paradigm, and you know, and part of bicycle diplomacy, which is you have to have the agility. You have to be able to identify where you need to go, to find your way there, to band with other cyclists along the way in order not to get run over by a taxi.
And in tandem, Mr. Chairman.
May I add one point? And yes, we have very interesting discussions and very meaningful discussions. And we are talking about establishing coalitions and addressing some issues and so on. And when I commented your question, answered your question, I said that for Kazakhstan, our national interests are main priority and so on. I would like to make some adjustments to my point, to my ideas. That's absolutely correct, but at the same time, a new paradigm, which we are discussing now, a new paradigm, we should keep balance between national interests and global interests. Because without...
That's another tightrope, isn't it?
Yeah, without it, there will be conflicts, there will be clashes and tensions and so on. And because any country has its own national interests, and sometimes its interests contradict interests of other countries. Therefore, it's so complicated issue. Therefore, if we are talking about new paradigm, we need to keep balance. Keep balance. Of course, our priority is our national interest. At the same time, every country has responsibility. Every country has to do something for the world in general. Every country has to do something in order to save our planet, in order to tackle climate change, in order to help countries in need and so on. Therefore, there are a lot of topics, issues which we need to address collectively. Therefore, I am talking about, and I am not talking about only national interests. I am talking about keeping balance between national interests and our common interests.
Yeah, I understand a balance is needed. Thomas, did you want to come in on this?
Well, very much along that line. UN Secretary General Guterres said a couple of years ago, you know, solidarity is in the self-interest of states, and I think that's a very important notion. I think most global challenges can only be tackled in cooperation, so we do have, this self-interest to cooperate. But coming back to the discussion on, more cooperation between those states that don't want to link up on a permanent basis with one of the blocs. I think this is very important, and we see it already. You have referred to some examples. We see it happening in multilateral negotiations. But of course, a lot of this is still very much political symbolism. And I ask myself, will there be a revival of some sort of a non-aligned movement in the medium to long term? Perhaps in a totally different composition. In the 70s and the 80s, the neutrals and non-aligned played a very important role in constructing the European security order. The Minsk process was actually driven by the neutral and non-aligned. This is not going to happen the same way, once this war is over and once we, come back to some sort of a cooperative security order again, hopefully at some point. We probably need different alliances, but I'm sure we need new alliances of those that are not willing to side with one of the blocs.
Neutrals.
Let me add a note of caution. I think alliances does not mean alliances, I would argue, within inclusive multilateral institutions. There is a strong trend today for minilateral institutions, which, as such, I can understand why they're happening. Quad, for instance, if you look at the Indo-Pacific, it's kind of, obvious. At the same time, I think these minilateral structures are not going to help us cope with global challenges. We need to have functioning, inclusive multilateral institutions, and I think that's very important. And here I would also add for a call to go beyond lip service to strong multilateral institutions. I think we hear nobody is against strong multilateral institutions. I was at the helm of a multilateral organization for quite a while, and I saw, too often that this just remained lip service at the end of the day when it comes to investing political capital, when it comes to invest financial resources into multilateral institutions. There is a lot of reluctance. When it comes to, adopting a multilateral mindset of compromise in decisive moments, well, all of a sudden, transactional approaches dominate over this, belief in strong multilateral institutions.
All right. I'll go to Danny and then Joshua.
Thank you. I thought I would follow up what my fellow panelists have said already, to warn all of us that as we go into this brave new international system that we want to imagine, we should not be going into it with simply rose-tinted glasses, that once we build the coalitions, everything will be fine. As Mr. Chairman said so clearly, every nation going forwards, we're going to have our own self-interests. Some of those self-interests will be conflicting with other nations, and some of those self-interests, in terms of serving up global public goods, we can be aligned, but we never do enough. We never do quite enough. So we still need some kind of overarching structure on this. But it is nonetheless a good move. Now, my colleague at the very end had described the non-aligned movement. And you'll remember that the non-aligned movement came out partly of the Bandung Principles and the Bandung Convention in 1955. Sometimes I wonder if it is time for us to have another full-blown Bandung 2.0, that we can take into that discussion the lessons that we have learned over the last 50, 70 years to remake a new non-aligned movement where we recognize countries are going to disagree, different groups within them will disagree, we don't do enough for global public goods, but it gives us that kind of a platform, a level playing field where the contest of ideas and contest of good thoughts about what we can do to make the world better can be put on the table once again. We don't have that. Someone spoke yesterday about how the multilateral institutions don't really work for her nation now because they're being used to serve only the interests of a great power. I think we do need multilateral institutions, but we do need to remake them in a way that serves all of us. Let me conclude by saying that when I say we, the middle powers, the small nations, third nations, we are the great majority of the world. We are 80% of humanity. If the world had any pretension to legitimate democratic voice, it is here that it needs to put its bet. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. I just hope that some of the lessons of the last 50 years have been learned. Just one would be enough, I suspect. Joshua.
Thank you. I'm enjoying this. This is very rich, going back and forth. So I think part of the challenge that you're hearing, at least that I'm hearing, is that there's pattern of simultaneous fragmentation, disintegration, and then evidences of new kinds of integration and coming together. And they're happening at the same time. And so you don't know whether to look at this part of the picture or to look at that part of the picture. And the reality is they're happening at the same time. My sense, for example, is I don't think we're going to see another block, another movement as it is. Possibly, with the possible exception of the one that we need, which I think is a big challenge, which is basically a non-aligned movement behind a resurgent multilateralism. You cited it at the beginning. It's the initiative of Secretary General Guterres. It's our common agenda, this big set of proposals that he's brought to member states. But I think that set of proposals, as ambitious, as positive, as comprehensive as it is, faces an uphill trajectory before the member states. And what will be interesting to see is to what extent the middle powers find common ground at the global level. We're not talking at the regional level. We're not talking at the sub-regional level. At the global level, whether they will find enough common ground to agree on a strengthening, broadly speaking, of the system that we've had since 1945. And I think that's still very much an open question.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. David, do you want to come in?
I support that opinion of experts who consider that multilateralism is on decline. If we witness and observe the current trends in the international economic relations and globally, so we can see that all the decisions are a matter of consideration at G20, mostly, or G7. They're not substitute the United Nations, but the major power now in that hands today.
Let's focus the question a bit more then.
Yeah.
What about sort of, how do you act in unilateral ways without irritating your friends and allies, especially the more powerful ones? And so that means should middle powers always act in multinational ways?
So the origin of middle powers has changed. We have to say that. If we observe the definition of middle powers remarked by Botero in the 16th century, so that means that, shortly speaking, that means that the middle power can withstand itself by its own without help of others. Now it has been changed. So that's why we have a paradox. From one point of view, in interdependent world, at all levels, bilateral, regional, and global levels, we're still linked. But the search for the decisions now, again I'm saying that now is conducting at the level of bilateral or regional levels today. So that's why I think the middle power today definitely are in that situation. They create new models today, new alliances. So we mentioned some of them today there. And the promotion of interest of a group of countries as a part of international community might be, I think, a priority in the future.
Okay.
So that is an evident trend. At least for a certain time, we'll be witnessing that, in my view.
Okay. I wonder sort of if I should put a same sort of question to everybody on the panel as we move towards the end of this session, starting with Danny. Is middle power diplomacy now coming into focus? This is the time. Perhaps people are moving away from the UN as a problem solver because it has so much on its plate. And if you can tell me, Danny, your thoughts as we go along the panel about where you see middle power diplomacy is going, and is this the time, the day, the year that we need middle power diplomacy at a time greater than ever, as perhaps a divided electorate in America loses sight of the international focus, and increasingly so, perhaps next year, that this is really a big time for diplomacy, middle power diplomacy.
Yeah, let me go out on a limb, Mr. Cole, and say the answer is yes. It is time for middle powers to take forward. But I would like to put in a plea that we don't think about the actors that are relevant as being just middle powers, but everyone else in the world as well. We now see the great powers trapped in a zero-sum view of their conflict. No one is going to give way. The outcome will be potentially destructive for all of humanity. The middle powers need to either nudge or provide a fulcrum point or be the bicycle that breaks that logjam. And I think now, more than ever, we need exactly this kind of agency. And from this panel alone, we've surfaced 25 different ideas that I think we could put on the table and take forwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Thomas?
Well, also very clear, yes, I think the world needs this middle power diplomacy, this bridge building. I very like, as a bicyclist, I very much like your image of the bicycle diplomacy. I think the world needs that. If we want to be addressing successfully, effectively the challenges that and the threats that we are facing, I think there is a need for that. There will be a lot of pushback. I think it's not very fashionable. I mean, you know, I can see that right now for my own country, you know, that remains neutral, abiding very strictly to the obligations of the international law on neutrality. While, of course, in terms of values, when it comes to breaches of international law, we clearly, you know, have our position. But this neutrality comes at a price, and I think I think you need to be. You need to conduct a very active foreign policy, you know, that kind of shows to the international community that being in the middle ground, being a bridge builder, is indeed useful. I think that's important. You need to be active. You need to be seen as useful.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas. We'll come to you at the end, Mr. Chairman, to give you the last word. But Joshua, do you want to come in first?
Is it the time for middle power diplomacy? I was thinking our existing multilateral institutions are inadequate, or rather they're antiquated. We're all aware of that. Great powers, medium powers, everyone's aware of that. On the other hand, you have a set of crises. We haven't used the word polycrisis today on this panel, but that's the word that's being used.
I tried to avoid it, actually.
Sorry?
I tried to avoid it.
There we go. I'm with you. But I just failed to do it. The proliferation of crises that require intensively and increasingly comprehensive responses that we don't have. Climate change, in a way, is both the domain of the greatest crisis and the most creativity and innovation in diplomacy today. This is a personal argument I'm making. That's where you see some of the most interesting patterns. Peace and security, much less so. In that context, I think middle power diplomacy is a response to the moment. It is neither ideal, it's not forever, but it is the means of responding to the difficult confluence of inadequate institutions and overwhelming and urgent need. Thank you.
Joshua. David, just very, very briefly.
So I would add that the particular attention should be devoted to preventive diplomacy, to preventive the risks as essential part of the middle power countries today, and better management. So we combine two factors that is globally, it's a paramount. Prevention of risks and better management. I think that might be the platform for successful stories for middle power diplomacy in future, in post-pandemic stage.
All right, thank you very much. And finally, Mr. Chairman, your thoughts.
I think I agree with my colleagues. The time has come for middle power diplomacy, but at the same time, I would like to say that it will be very long, very difficult, very controversial process. It can take, who knows, maybe 50 years, maybe 100 years. Nobody knows. I don't think it would be easy to change the current international system. It would be, I don't think it would be easy to reform the UN Security Council. Absolutely not. Therefore, I think it will take time. It will be a very, very difficult process, but at the same time, we need to start. We need to start. We need, step by step, we need to change our current international system. We need to reform international institutions, including the UN, the UN institutions, and therefore I think time has come, and people and countries need changes. And in this situation, middle power countries, middle powers can play a crucial role.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Moderator, I think our time is up, and therefore...
I was about to say that.
I would like to thank you. Thank you for your great job.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And I think we've proved the effectiveness and the need for middle power diplomacy. And if we have, it's down to our expert panel. Please show your appreciation. Thank you very much.